Einstein and his new theory of space. Part 2. The Egyptians, in their quest for the abiding place of reality, vainly searched for 49 worlds. For while a divine wisdom was manifested in each, the sovereign power itself dwelt in none of them. Again and again, the old philosophers sought to catch God in the net of thought, but the deity forever eluded them. There were gods in the heavens, heroes upon the earth, and demons in the underworld. But the invisible and unknowable power which supported the broad expanse of creation remained utterly obscure, self-sufficient, and independent. It may have been the Brahmins who discovered that things must exist in place, and that place therefore was a sort of fourth dimension which divided things by limiting them and establishing their boundaries. All creations were things, and being differentiated by the all, they were limited as to duration by time, as to number by quantity, and as to situation by place. The supreme power of the universe not being a creation but an ever-abiding permanence unlimited by any term of dimension, could not be in place, therefore space was regarded as its proper habitation. Space was the utter privation of place, for whereas place must be somewhere, space must be everywhere. Forms are ever-changing, but space is unchangeable, and by virtue of its utter abstraction is an appropriate symbol for the absolute and unknowable existence which is described as utter potentiality. All efforts to lure even the shadow of the Creator from his abysmal depths failed, and philosophy was forced to be content to realize in an abstract sort of way that the infinite dwelt in eternity, even as the finite dwells in time. Gradually, the term space came to be regarded as synonymous with spirit. Not a spirit, but spirit in the form of Purusha, or an ultimate divine substance. This is the self of the agnostic Buddhist schools, and by interpretation signifies the ultimate reality. The description of Brahma, given in the second chapter of the first book of the Vishnu Purana, is an effort to conceive of space as a divine being from whose all-embracing consciousness the phenomena of existence proceeds. The sage Parasara discourses thus: "Who can describe him who is not to be apprehended by the sense? Who is the best of all things, the supreme soul, self-existent, who is devoid of all the distinguishing characteristics of complexion, caste, or the like, and is exempt from birth, vicissitude, death, or decay? Who is always and alone, who exists everywhere, and in whom all things here exist, and who is, thence named Vasudeva. He is Brahma, supreme, Lord, eternal, unborn, imperishable, undecaying, of one essence, ever pure and free from defects." The mystery of space is twofold, for while within it abides the absolute clothed in its veils of unknowable essence, it is also the deep or abyss from which the gods of creation conjure forth the chaya, or shadow which is called the world. The world then exists in and of space, and by the law of its being must ultimately return to its depthless profundity. From all of this it is evident why the Egyptians referred to space as the thrice deep darkness, or the 3 times obscure. The use of the 3 signified its supreme elevation, and also the triple nature of its mystery, for it was the vanishing point of mind, matter, and time. It is this abstract and mysterious space, then, upon which Einstein has conferred the attribute of hunger. Space becomes a devourer, not literally, of course, but rather in the sense that it is continually reabsorbing into itself the forms which it has temporarily imbued with individuality. As the slowly melting ice flows sink back into the sea, as the rotting tree stump finally mingles its substance with the earth, so creations, wearied with being, sink slowly but inevitably into the eternal sleep of peace. As space, then, was the one beginning, so surely it is the end of all beginnings. Space is the inevitable condition into which all other conditions flow, the destiny which nothing can escape. Has Einstein seen the infinite inevitable? Has he discovered by mathematics that although numbers are seemingly endless, there is an ultimate cipher which circumscribes them all? Has his vision revealed to him the great pageantry of worlds which, emerging like phantoms from the eternal mystery and abiding their destined span, merge again like fading shadows into space? That which endures, Through mathematics, one approaches very close to the ineffable mysteries, for as Pythagoras so often stated to his disciples, numbers are the most appropriate form symbols of the secrets of the three worlds, and him who abides in them. Higher mathematics can prepare the soul for the opening of the inner eye, for which reason geometry has been called the initiator. Through an understanding of the theory of space, then, one approaches a knowledge of the nature and constitution of consciousness. For whereas thought partake of the qualities of matter, consciousness possesses the azonic attributes of space. Consciousness, then, is that supreme awareness which in our benighted state we would regard as absolute awareness. As space may be said to devour matter, so consciousness, the supreme knowing, devours mind, the so-called supreme knower. The space of Einstein is almost synonymous with the samadhi of Vedanta or the nirvana of Buddhism. It is this mysterious space consciousness, opposed to mortal place consciousness, that the yogins seek when they strive to life themselves from here to everywhere by meditation. Dimensions are limitations, and the ascetic struggle to extricate himself from that labyrinth of illusion which philosophers term the phenomenal sphere. Only when the soul achieves union with space and mingles its own qualities with infinite being can it escape those changes constituting the life cycle. While the body, because of the laws through which it exists, follows the cosmic urge to condense, the spirit, being of a superior essence, desires to be diffused and to become one with life itself, the abstract parent. Numbers reveal this. For by the qualities of numeration, all mysteries of nature may be discovered by the soul, which is en rapport with the laws of life. Thus, Einstein's space, which is synonymous with perfect existence, is a condition of allness, which, through the assertion of its own inseparability, scatters the sense of diversity or fragmentism. On a lower plane, the space becomes synonymous with wisdom, which must inevitably eat it up, in the sense of absorbing into itself all lesser states of intelligence. The Atlantis, the lost world. There is a persistent rumor that the age-old legend of Atlantis has intrigued the curiosity of no less a person than Ambassador Charles G. Dawes, whose underslung pipe and efforts to Americanize the court of St. James have already brought him a considerable measure of distinction. In a clipping at hand, it is stated that the Honorable Mr. Dawes is so impressed with the Atlantis idea that he has financed a search of the Vatican Library in hopes of discovering among the musty old documents there some key to the enigma. The investigation, which is being carried on by a Yale scholar, is particularly concerned with the Mayan dialect. The hypothesis is that if the secrets of this language can be uncovered, it may then be possible to decipher at least some of the many strange inscriptions in Yucatan and Guatemala, which have so far baffled archaeologists. The ex-vice president entertains the hope that the strange hieroglyphics deeply cut into the walls of temples or into the faces of monuments will, when correctly read, forever settle the Atlantis problem. Is it possible that Ambassador Dawes has been reading with profit certain sections of Baldwin's Ancient America? For example, the following sentences are illuminating. The words Atlas and Atlantis have no satisfactory etymology in any language known to Europe. They are not Greek and cannot be traced to any known language of the Old World. The conclusion is inevitable. If the Old World is of no assistance in the matter, try the New World. Again, the point of attack is clearly indicated. The only part of the New World which apparently developed any historical instinct or perpetuated any systematic record was Central America, a term which for our purposes we will extend to cover Mexico and the northern parts of South America. Those who scoff at the idea of a submerged Atlantic continent must first of all explain away the descriptions given by Plato in the Critias and the Timaeus. Plato's accounts carry considerable weight inasmuch as the integrity and learning of that philosopher cannot easily be assailed. Up to the beginning of the 16th century, designers of maps included the Atlantean island in their charts and globes, simply on the authority of Plato. The anti-Atlantists, however, contend that in the Critias, Plato takes a flight into fiction, manuring, to use Plutarch's words, the little seed of the Atlantis myth, which Solon had discovered in the Egyptian temples. But now etymology rises up to discomfort the scoffers, for had Plato or any of the Greeks fabricated this account, they would unquestionably have used a word derived from their own speech to designate the last continent. The same would be true of the Egyptians. In Isis Unveiled, H.P. Blavatsky calls attention to the fact that both the story of Atlantis and the name of the country itself came to the Greeks as a historical inheritance of the most remote antiquity. The Egyptian priests told Solon that the accounts of Atlantis which they possessed had been deciphered from inscriptions upon ancient columns. These pillars, composed of some unknown and imperishable substance, possibly the fabled Pillars of Enoch, had been erected before the deluge. In fact, the columns had been constructed for the express purpose of withstanding the terrible upheavals which were to lay barren a considerable part of the earth. Crantor, writing circa 300 BC, declared that at that time the pillars were still in existence. In 1912, Mr. Pierre Termier, a member of the Academy of Science and Director of Service for the Geological Chart of France, delivered a remarkable lecture on Atlantis before the Institut Oceanographique. This lecture was later translated and published in the annual report of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution for the year ending June 30th, 1915. The valiant French savant declared, "It seems more and more evident that a vast region, continental or made up of great islands, has collapsed west of the Pillars of Hercules." Mr. Termier's reasons were purely geological and have been well substantiated by subsequent findings. Theopompus and Marcellus, ancient historians, refer to both a continent and islands in the Atlantic Ocean. Marcellus writes of 7 small islands and 3 great ones which together constitute the Atlantides. Confusion is continually arising as to whether the 7 islands mentioned were actually 7 independent land areas or merely 7 national divisions of the great continent itself. Many volcanic cataclysms occurred before the last upheaval, which finally destroyed Poseidonus, the name given to the last form of the great oceanic continent. The Azores Islands are now regarded as remnants of the mountain peaks of Poseidonus. It is possible that Poseidonus was the land of mud which, in the Troan Codex, an early writing of the Mayas of Yucatan, was destroyed in the year 6 Khan on the 11th Mulak in the month Zak. Whether this figure can be reconciled with the date of the Atlantean destruction as preserved by Plato, which would be about 9500 BC, is a matter which only time can determine. But when the Codex declares that the land of mud was sacrificed, that 10 countries were torn asunder and scattered and finally sank, carrying their 64 million inhabitants with them, it should be remembered that 10 countries coincides exactly with the number of islands described by Marcellus and the 10 kingdoms described by Plato. Having exhausted the possibilities of the Greek and Egyptian writings, at least until more records come to light, we are justified in turning to the peoples of the old Americas for such information as they may possess on this fascinating subject. There is much evidence of the Atlantean blood among the Red Indians, the Bering Strait migration theory notwithstanding. It is highly possible that Asiatic tribes also reached this country and by the mingling of 2 definite strains of blood produced what we now term the American Indian race. In fact, more than 2 races may be represented in their bloodstream. John Johnstone, Esquire, in Archaeologia Americana, says that the Swanese, an Algonquin tribe, have a tradition that their ancestors crossed the sea. These same peoples preserved for many centuries an annual ceremony in celebration of a deliverance, but it is impossible to discover the nature of the evil which they providentially escaped. The catastrophe must have been of considerable import to become the subject of such perpetuation. May it have been their escape from the sinking Atlantis? Schoolcraft in the Indian Tribes of the United States, writing of the North American Indians as a group, says, "They relate generally that there was a deluge at an ancient epoch which covered the earth and drowned mankind, except a limited number. Even the Chinese perpetuate an account of the flood, and as it is quite evident that the earth's surface was never entirely inundated, all these accounts may be traced to the Atlantean catastrophe. There is no more significant fragment bearing on this subject than the famous speech which Montezuma, the Mexican king, delivered to Cortez, the Spanish conqueror. I would have you to understand before you begin your discourse that we are not ignorant or stand in need of your persuasions to believe that the great prince you obey is descended from our ancient Quetzalcoatl, lord of the 7 caves of the Navatlax, and lawful king of those 7 nations which gave beginning to our Mexican empire. In several of the Mexican codices, the origin of the people is symbolically set forth by diagrams showing 7 irregular circles, presumably intended to represent caverns. In each of these is a twisted-up human figure resembling an embryo, and these 7 are the progenitors of the race. If we are bold enough to claim that these so-called caverns really signified islands or continents, we shall not be more daring than Colonel Hamilton Smith, who advances the same hypothesis in his learned work, The Natural History of the Human Species. It should be quite evident that when Montezuma refers to Quetzalcoatl as the Lord of the 7 Caves, he does not intend to convey that this divine man, Prince Feathered Serpent, was literally a ruler over 7 holes in the ground. It is a common legend among the red men that their progenitors came out of holes in the earth, ascending from their dark retreats to escape a flood or deluge loosed by one of the gods of the underworld. Such an account might well imply that these Indians had originally inhabited the lowlands but had fled to the mountains to escape the terrible tidal waves caused by the Atlantean disaster, and which unquestionably, at least temporarily, inundated great areas of the earth. Plato infers that the Atlantean deluge was loosed by the gods because of the sins of men. In the American Indian legends, the flood from which the red men escaped in various ways was also an act of retribution on the part of a great Manido. Referring to Montezuma's speech to Cortez, Schoolcraft notes that in speaking of Quetzalcoatl, or Lord of the 7 Caves, it is probably implied that he was the lawful chief of 7 bands, tribes, or nations. He was the feathered snake metamorphosed into a god by the peoples to whom he brought culture and enlightenment. There is evidence that the rulers of Atlantis were known as the Serpent Kings, probably the winged serpents as a tribute to their royalty. In the old traditions, it is written that the serpent originally walked upright, but because of his pride and sin, he fell. The occult traditions further declare that in an ancient age there were winged serpents upon the earth. These may well have been the famous Atlantean sorcerers described in the Oriental secret traditions. Among the Portuguese, there is a legend of a mysterious island called by them Isla das Cidades, the island of the 7 cities, or Antilla. Are these 7 cities the 7 golden cities of Cibola, which the Spanish sought for in their conquest of Lower California? Are they also the original 7 cities ruled over by the feathered serpents or winged seraphs? The thought of the serpents is not so far-fetched when we remember that the Arab geographers always referred to Antilla, or Atlantis, as the Dragon's Isle. Was the dragon the great king Thevatat, the mysterious spirit who ruled Atlantis from the air and was unseen at any time according to the ancient traditions, and whose agents upon the earth were the serpent kings, who carried his feathered scepter as symbols of their regency? If so, then the natural symbol for this dragon king, lord of the 7 cities or nations, would be the 7-headed serpent, which is perpetuated today as the famous 7-headed Naga of Cambodia. Thus, the Atlantean Empire is represented by a strange dragon, whose heads represent the sources of the race and whose long coils reveal the migrations of the Atlanteans in their serpentine path across the world. The account of Atlantis being under the dominion of a great invisible being may have given rise to certain Celtic legends, particularly those dealing with the account of how Ireland was originally peopled by an invisible race and ruled over by an Ariel king. These myths may have come to Ireland by way of the men from the sea, accounts of whom have been preserved in their traditions. These men were the Atlantean sorcerers or snakes whom St. Patrick was supposed to have destroyed. Both Homer and Horace apparently sense the allegorical import of Atlantis, for by reading between the lines one gathers from their writings the impression that to them Atlantis signified a superior universe or higher world, possibly the one which descended into matter when the physical universe was created. hence the fabled Eden, or that antediluvian sphere referred to in scriptures as ruled over by the kings of Edom. Atlantis thus becomes the Elysian fields, or the abode of the blessed, and is called by the Welsh Avalon. The Atlantides, or 7 islands, are described by early mythologists as the 7 Pleiades, daughters of Atlas, for they were lifted out of the depths upon the shoulders of the great giant of the earth. In order that the wide extent of the Atlantis story may be better appreciated, for traditional accounts of both the continent itself and the disaster which destroyed it have been preserved among nearly all civilized peoples, consider the words of Louis Jacoliot, a French writer on Oriental philosophies, in his Histoire des Verges, a religious belief common to Malacca and Polynesia, that is to say, to the 2 opposite extremes of the oceanic world, affirms that all these islands once formed 2 immense countries, inhabited by yellow men and black men, always at war, and that the gods, wearied with their quarrels, having charged ocean to pacify them, the latter swallowed up the 2 continents, and since then it has been impossible to make him give up his captives. The other continent referred to by M. Jacoliot is unquestionably Lemuria, the great area of land which is said to have disappeared prior to the sinking of Atlantis, leaving only the Australasian archipelago. Fragmentary information concerning these continents is continually coming to light in different parts of Asia, and geology again confirms the old traditions. A discussion of Atlantis would be incomplete without a brief outline of the causes for its disappearance. The great king Thevatat, the invisible dragon, is unquestionably what Eliphas Levi would call the astral light, the same force which the Knights Templars were accused of worshipping under the form of the goat of Mendes. The astral light is the seat of sorcery, or what the ancients termed infernal magic. The ruler of this sphere is the great fire prince Samael, who is supposed to have taken upon himself the form of a serpent and seduced Eve. His sphere is ruled by Mars, or more correctly symbolized by it, and his key word is ambition. The Atlanteans were natural clairvoyants, or it might be better to say natural mediums. They could see the invisible worlds, but they did not understand the proper use of the great forces of the astral light. It will be noted that nearly all Aboriginal peoples worship various forms of demons and elemental spirits, also the ghosts of the dead. The present red and black primitive races are of Atlantean and Lemurian origin, and their demon gods are the creatures which their progenitors actually saw in the astral light. By various forms of magic, many of these tribes can still control these elemental beings in the astral light. The question as to what caused the destruction of Atlantis is then very simply answered. Atlantis never produced a philosopher. But the question may be asked, how can an individual or a race possess supernatural power without philosophy? This question can be answered by another. Why are mediums so often illiterate and, having so little knowledge of the affairs of the living, still talk with the dead? The Atlanteans, like the medium, did not possess supernatural power technically. They were possessed by it. They were moved by the astral king like Ouija boards, and as his sphere was one of excess and fury, he poured forth his qualities through them until the whole civilization collapsed in a common ruin. Before the destruction of the continent, the Atlanteans were divided, for in a portion of the people was born the realization of personal responsibility. These escaped from the rulership of the Dragon King and, obeying the instructions of the Great White Lord, prepared for themselves a better destiny. When the destruction came and the fire which the sorcerers had invoked consumed them, the white adepts, led by the great father of the Thinkithians, Noah, escaped and established themselves in those lands which had survived the great destruction. The demon king Thevatat did not always control Atlantis. He gradually gained dominion over it as an evil habit gradually gains control of a human life. He finally obsessed Atlantis and those of the Atlantean adepts, superior beings who incarnated in Atlantis to protect the people, who could no longer protect the continent from the demon of the astral light, became the leaders of the several migrations. These adepts were also termed serpents, but with them the serpent had been raised as is described in the Bible. It had not lost its feet as shown in the Egyptian glyphs, and it wore the feather of Maat, the symbol of truth. Quetzalcoatl, whose proper symbol is an upraised snake and who carried the cross, was one of the white adepts. For it is declared in the codices that he was a white man, a term which may not necessarily mean color but rather purity. To return again to the modern times, an interesting note appears in the July 1930 number of Popular Mechanics magazine. In an article, The Hunt for the Lost Atlantis by Leslie O'Rear, 2 paragraphs are representative. Already there have been wrested from the sea the secrets of several ancient cities that were submerged by some unrecorded catastrophe, and what those discoveries have revealed inspired Count Byron Kuhn de Porroc, famed archaeologist, to organize in collaboration with French and American institutions this new expedition in search for the lost Atlantis. Count de Porroc will search for Atlantis equipped with a diving bell that can descend 2,500 feet, laboratory facilities, machine guns for land giants which they expect to encounter in certain parts of the Sahara, Tuaregs, a fierce tribe presumably the last of the Atlanteans, a 140-foot yacht, grappling apparatus, wireless equipment, a submarine, and an aeroplane. The Count himself says, "We embark upon this romantic quest, confident that we shall give to the world some insight into the most ancient civilization of all time, the lost Atlanteans." From all this, it is evident that the interest in this ancient problem is increasing daily and must continue until the solution is found. Atlantis demands its place in history. It is the missing link in the great chain of civilization, without which many of the greatest mysteries of anthropology must remain unsolved. Also, as Ignatius Donnelly reminds us, Atlantis is the unsuspected basis of nearly all great world mythologies, with their weird tales of giants and demons battling for ages against the gods. It is my intention to prepare a companion article to this one to deal with Atlantis as an element in philosophy rather than as an element in history. Not to disprove the existence of Atlantis as a continent, but to show that the historical account is used by Plato to cover certain mysteries of the soul, which as an initiate he could only reveal through symbols. In the meantime, we will conclude this brief resume with the climax of Mr. Termier's address to the Institut Oceanographique. I dream of the last night of Atlantis, to which perhaps the last night, that great night of humanity, will bear semblance. The young men have all departed for the war beyond the islands of the Levant and the distant pillars of Hercules. Those who remain, men of mature age, women, children, old men, and priests, anxiously question the marine horizon, hoping there to see the first sails appearing, heralds of the warrior's return. But tonight the horizon is dark and vacant. How shadowy the sea grows, how threatening is the sky so overcast. The earth for some days has shuddered and trembled. The sun seems rent asunder, here and there exhaling fiery vapors. It is even reported that some of the mountain craters have opened, whence smoke and flames belch forth, and stones and ashes are hurled into the air. Now on all sides a warm gray powder is raining down. Night has quite fallen, fearful darkness. Nothing can be seen without lighted torches. Suddenly, seized with blind terror, the multitude rushes into the temples. But lo, even the temples crumble, while the sea advanced and invades the shore, its cruel clamor rising loud above all other noise. What takes place might indeed be the divine wrath. Then quiet reigns. No longer are there either mountains or shores, no longer anything save the restless sea, asleep under the tropic sky. The passing of the Sorcerer. The facts concerning the death of Rasputin are too well known to require restatement in this article. Our consideration then is to place a new emphasis upon these dramatic incidents. That Rasputin was a hypnotist cannot be denied. He was repeatedly accused of employing infernal agencies to achieve his ends. The word infernal is generally applied by the Church to all forms of magic except where such works are performed by the clergy, when the term divine is substituted. Gregory was a believer in magic, an adept in charms and incantations. Tracts were circulated to the effect that this mysterious starets had sold his soul to Satan, and that he had studied the sorcery of the lamas. Rasputin further possessed the power of prophecy. This is proved on not less than 2 counts. He stated definitely that if an evil befell him, the Russian crown was doomed. He predicted that within 6 months of his own death, the empire would fall, and history reveals the accuracy of his predictions. Rasputin felt his own life to be inextricably linked with that of the imperial Russian house. This mysterious peasant also, curiously enough, sensed his own doom. For the very night that he set out on his last earthly adventure, he made the very odd remark that where he was going that night no one would follow him. That Rasputin accomplished wonders with the young Tsarevich is well authenticated. The efforts made by his detractors to explain away his supernatural powers by declaring that he caused the young prince to be poisoned so that he could administer an antidote is a rather clumsy effort to evade facts. The Tsarevich was an invalid from birth, having inherited the disease of the Habsburg family. A Tibetan magician, for many years the confidant of the Tsar, concentrated all his learning upon the healing of the young heir apparent. His efforts failed, however, and until the coming of Rasputin, the royal family was continually in a frantic state over the child's health. To affirm that Rasputin prepared this stage would be equal to asserting that he had deflected the laws of heredity. Nor were his healings limited to this one case alone, but distributed at various intervals throughout his astonishing career. As he sat facing Prince Yusupov, eating poisoned cake and drinking poisoned wine, his executioner had the terrible conviction that Rasputin knew what was being done to him but depended upon some tremendous power within himself to escape death. Whatever this power was, it was nearly sufficient. Rasputin proved that the deadliest poison could not destroy him. A world which dreads to admit the supernatural has tried to explain away this mystery also, but in vain. The cake and the wine contained sufficient poison to have instantly killed a score of men. Yet after partaking heartily of both, Gregory rose to his feet, and in his usual jovial mood began a leisurely examination of the pictures and objects of art about the banquet room of his host. One can well imagine the consternation, amazement, and terror that these circumstances must have created within the nature of Prince Yusupov. Was this man indeed supernatural? Was he, as he had claimed, a divine incarnation? Was he a minister of God or the servant of Satan? The last act of the tragedy finally came. The poison having failed, a group of conspirators who had gathered for such an emergency came to the assistance of the prince, riddling the body of the monk with bullets and slashing him with their knives. They bound Rasputin and dragged him through the snow to the river, into which they threw his still living body. Later, it was declared that the body had been recovered and was given private burial by the Tsar and his immediate family. Then came the revolution. Records of all kinds were destroyed or perverted to serve propagandists of the new regime. The Tsar himself vanished, and his fate is still shrouded with mystery. The result is, to sum up the opinions of his biographers, that authentic information concerning Rasputin is one of the most difficult things in the world to secure. Dead but 14 years, his personality is one of the greatest enigmas of all times. Figures like that of Rasputin terrify this prosaic century. We are afraid to think in terms of sorcery. In this very matter-of-fact world which we have attempted to mold into conformity with our own matter-of-fact dispositions, there is no place for the bizarre Rasputin. We turn even viciously against anyone who by word or act attacks the smug sufficiency of our explanations for everything. Rasputin had to be destroyed. The world demanded it. If he had not been removed, he might have hazarded the integrity of our materialistic code. We must explain away the supernatural in self-defense. We dare not admit the existence of any force in nature more subtle than economics or more powerful than gold. Even God must be eliminated lest he compromise the utter superiority of man. When, as will happen sometimes, the miraculous takes flesh and walks among us, our discomfiture knows no bounds. We scoff as long as we can. When that fails, we persecute, and as a last extremity we ignore. For these reasons we shall probably never understand the true nature of Rasputin. We seek safety behind the sweeping assertion that he was simply an impostor, a charlatan, and a quack. Having delivered ourselves of these opinions, we feel safe again. Turn over on the other side and continue our interrupted slumber of the ages. At this writing, there comes to hand an interesting example of this attitude. The London Daily Express of November 15th writes that a ghostly apparition of a man in armor floating over the heads of the dancers in the Convent Garden Opera House last night brought the music to an abrupt halt, while the conductor, Herman Dersky, sank into a chair and dropped his baton. Dersky said that he feared the apparition was an omen of disaster, adding that it was a helmeted and armed figure moving slowly through the air. So much for the account. A few days later comes the explanation, so simple that it is positively asinine. We are informed that the helmeted and armed figure moving through the air was a night watchman or some other equally insignificant person wearing a fireman's helmet. For the latter peculiarity, no explanation is given, nor are we told how the figure chanced to be floating through the air. Herman Dersky, it seems, did not know a night watchman when he saw one and collapsed at the sight of a caretaker indiscreetly floating overhead during the dance. The further explanation was given that he only saw the shadow of the night watchman. In fact, this latter personality is exceedingly attenuated, there being no proof that he was there at all. The whole thing may be summed up in this thought. We must explain away everything that we do not understand. The explanations do not have to be good because the average individual does not think anyway. The toast of the age is, "To our opinions. May they ever be right, but whether they be right or wrong, gentlemen, our opinions." The present financial crisis in the light of philosophy. And now we come to an interesting problem. The American people are more or less tricky. During the past years, for an unknown reason, they have been building up their savings accounts, which jumped forward to the sum of over $2 billion. These savings accounts mean the little man's money, $50, $100, $500, or maybe $1,000. The year just previous to this stock crash, for the first time in 10 years, the savings accounts dropped, and last year holds the keynote to our financial condition, in the depleted savings accounts in the vast body of the proletarian. Now, out of all these symptoms, we have created a new picture, a picture that must be very carefully studied. The World War produced an enormous demand. The United States was in a favored position to take advantage of the world industrial situation. Her manufacturing activities were immensely increased. Corporations were organized and stock floated, which produced enormous profits. But this condition did not last. After the war, depleted Europe resumed its industrial activities, and the market for United States products was again constricted by European competition. The result was the United States had a producing plant greater than the market to consume its products, one of the most dangerous conditions that can exist with any people. It is here that the inherent genius for trickery of the American mind shows itself. When legitimate markers are no longer available, this genius turns to preying upon the weaker-minded people of our own country. This it does by inducing them to gamble, or, as it is euphemistically called, invest in the stock market in such a way as to hazard their savings in order to make sudden gains. During the past few years, there has been much propaganda toward introducing the great mass of wage earners into the intricacies of speculation. It has been demonstrated to them beyond all doubt that any individual who invests his money at 6% is an idiot, and that he should never invest unless he can get a fortune the first year. Gold bricks have been peddled like collar buttons and shoestrings, and individuals without training, without realization of the background, have come to the conclusion that the stock market has turned into a humanitarian enterprise, and it has cost them plenty to find out that it hasn't. The stock market is, comparatively speaking, a closed corporation and even a greater risk than Monte Carlo. Now imagine for a moment that as a small stockholder you have placed with the bulls and the bears. You realize that not only do you take the chance of your stock going up or down, but whichever way it goes, you lose. It is fixed that way. It isn't the fact that if it goes up to a point, you make $1, and if it goes down to a point, you lose $1. If it goes up a point, you make $1, but if it goes down a point, you lose 10. It is a very effective method of relieving the proletarian of superfluous cash. So you pay to play against a cold deck. The fluctuation in stock depends upon the condition of the company which issued those stocks. It signifies the condition of the pool controlling that stock at the moment. That pool needs watching. You do not know what it will do, but the thing it does will break you every time with mathematical regularity. And unless an individual knows more about the subject than most investors do, he is riding for an inevitable fall. Stock gambling thrives upon individual cupidity. The whole thing falls back upon the besetting sin of the average individual, namely that he wants something for nothing. The only way that you can lure him into such an enterprise is to promise him something that he is not technically entitled to. Then when he does not get it, he is very much upset. Now we come to another interesting problem in American finance, and that is how to make your money work for you. No doubt you have all heard that argument. 10 hogs will send your son through college, 1/4 acre of citrus fruit and retire. 10 acres of alfalfa will make you a millionaire. If the individual were philosophically minded, he would realize certain facts of national integrity. Unless money is distributed rather evenly, something cracks. But strange as it may seem, we buy. When any faction, political or economic, comes into control of more than a certain percentage of money, the whole national integrity is in danger. And here we have the reason why the savings accounts went down. Men with 1,000 wanted to be millionaires. They were working against a combination that simply cannot be beaten. That does not mean that an individual does not occasionally beat the game, temporarily at least. It has been estimated, however, that the most unfortunate thing a man can do is to beat the stock exchange. From that day on, he is ruined. From that time, he will never be an honest man again, for he will live in terms of lottery and chance. The best thing for the investor is to lose his first investment and lose it hard. Then he will come down to the realization of the value of a dollar. When your dollar is worth more than 100 cents, somebody else's dollar is worth less than 100 cents, because there are only just so many cents to each dollar. Besides the conditions mentioned, we have still another element to consider, and that is the development of the machine age, whereby the national productivity has been immensely increased. But our knowledge of how to distribute the benefits properly among the members of society has not kept pace with our knowledge of mechanical improvements. We have, in fact, the problem of the development of a national morality that requires foresight and farsight in those who shall lead our people. This country must adopt true philosophical and scientific principles, or it will inevitably go down to national disaster. The basis of that philosophical system must be the recognition of the fact that the quality and integrity of the individual must be supported by the social system in which he lives. These truths should be self-evident. 1. That in an industrial sense, an individual is worth only what he produces. 2. That an individual is entitled to a certain percentage of his own production. 3. That the only basis for increased income of the individual should be his increased personal value to society at large, or the industrial unit in which he functions. Wherever a man has a dollar that he has not earned, another man has lost a dollar without getting anything for it. It does not show up immediately, since the vicious circle is very wide, but in the body politic it will show up. For where you have millions of people in the transfer of vast sums of money for which there is no tangible evidence or reason, you have financial insecurity. So we return to our original premise of the American being a natural financier. He likes to work with money, and the situation is steadily becoming worse. The stock crash is only indicative of the tendency in this field of exploitation. Now, faced with all these problems as we are today, what is the philosophical answer? What is the inevitable result of this condition upon the people? To begin with, we find individual integrity undermined. We find the individual no longer honestly ambitious. The present attitude toward money paralyzes the desire to improve self. He is ambitious only in the field of exploitation. Men are educated in the science of exploiting each other. The average individual becomes a human hunter who is out just as surely as a meat hunter or a seal hunter, looking for the pelt of his neighbor, and many a man knows what it means to be skinned. It is positively dangerous in these days to have it known that you have a dollar. People sit around at night trying to think you out of that dollar. They plan to get your dollar and give nothing, at any rate to give as little as possible. This is the short-sighted business system. Hence, everyone who has anything must guard it with his life because somebody else wants it. It is virtually a state of affairs where each individual stalks the other, like you do game. waiting, hoping that he will discern some method of sandbagging him gently. A psychological salesman is trained to prey upon one faculty in the human mind, and that faculty is cupidity. If he can awaken your cupidity, he will get your money. So it follows that the world is filled with investments financed upon this quality inherent in human nature. We will not have proper government until the wisest and ablest administer the concerns of government. The true right of possession should be determined by the will to use that possession well, and until that is done, nature will continually interfere to dispossess those who do not cooperate with this principle. We represent a government of the people, sometimes by the people and occasionally for the people. Until individual value is based upon individual integrity, we shall never have financial solidarity, for solidarity is not the possession of property or affairs, but the able administration of them. At the present time, money is manipulated by the fingers of intrigue, and so we have sorrow and trouble. This country has too much power per capita and not enough integrity. Wherever a condition exists in which the individual or the masses are victimized to serve either corporate interests or personalities, we have fertile reasons for national disaster and decay. Hundreds of years ago, it was predicted that this nation would be destroyed not by a foreign, but by an internal foe. For it would be hard to find a nation strong enough to break us by war, invasion, or anything of that kind. Our deadly enemy is finance. Whether the American people can break the vicious circle of our financial system is problematical. If, however, the system is not broken, national disaster is certain. Today we have a civilization which, in the terms of one of America's own leading financiers, deals entirely in terms of dollars. It is not improbable that someday we will say, "Who is that man walking down the street?" And the reply will be, "That is $4.50. Our first and only name for such a person will be his cash value. The dollar has become the basis of hate, the basis of friendship, the basis of ethics, the basis of most of life's relationships. Your dollar acts the way you do. Someone truly said that we have nothing of ourselves, but that all we have is that which the universe loans to us while we are here. We are rich in truth only through the experience which we have gained from the right to use that which is loaned to us. There is much to be learned from the study of money, for money is a mirror in which are reflected the souls of men. Your dollar is a living picture of yourself, responding to the subtlest impulses of your mind, shadowing your conceit, manifesting your weakness, and as intriguing as your own self. Ignorance and cupidity are the two qualities upon which dishonesty thrives, and every individual who does not stand for what he believes is guilty of one or the other. So out of the aftermath of this stock crash, out of the wild gyrations of our financial values, we come to the realization, no longer to be ignored, that we have translated the altar of God into a cash register and transformed the ethical systems of mankind into a gigantic instrument of exploitation. We have taken life, our thoughts, our hopes, yes, even each other's muscles, sinews, and nerves, and reduced them to commercial terms. We have taken lofty aspirations and ruthlessly sacrificed them to the most cruel and senseless system of living ever despised by man. We have forgotten to dream, forgotten to hope, forgotten to love, forgotten to understand or aspire in this vain effort to acquire the wealth of the universe. But if we should acquire all the gold there is, we would be poorer than on the day we started. No nation can be just a banking house. If we are unresponsive to the charms of truth and beauty, if we underrate the value of human character, if we sacrifice the eternal for the temporal, we have reached and passed the zenith of our accomplishment, and, like the decadent races of the past, must sink into a nameless grave.